Okay, so I'm talking about the extra monetary aspects of monetary units. I'm particularly interested in putting conversations about money in a broader comparative perspective with other related forms of particular measurement and number. So today I want to make the case for broadening approaches to monetary unions, in which I think we can include most, if not all, contemporary forms of money as we know it. I want to argue for the necessity of supplementing work on money with an attention to the extra monetary forms subjected to similar sorts of utopianization, rationalization, and formalization since the late 18th and early 19th century. So I will contend that, in contrary to what one might call the monetary exceptionalism of dominant views in older forms of anthropology and classic social theory, so for example, contrary to Paul Bohannon's famous assertion that money is one of the shatteringly simplifying ideas of all time, and that any other new and compelling idea, it creates its own revolution. In contrast to that and other similar statements, money neither makes the world go round, nor is it fundamentally dissimilar from other roughly contemporary modern standards. And so second, I want to compare the fate of monetary unions with metrological unions, that is, unions of measurement, and unions of number. And so this particular question emerged in the context of George's discussion a couple of days ago of the fact that all known monetary unions have failed. And I was wondering if one could or could not make the same point about unions of number and measure, and why or why not. And so in this regard, at the end of my presentation, I have some provisional and rather speculative conclusions about why, for example, the International System of Units, or SI, and or decimal calculation, seen as a number union particularly germane to currency, have not yet failed. But first, some background on both my interest in this subject and on some important narratives of the anthropology of money. So in my larger work, my main intervention is to criticize and reconfigure overly mythologized anthropological understandings of money and modernity. And so in the anthropology of money, you have two main stories at work. You have a story of what one might call money's progress. So how did we get from barter to Bitcoin, from very material monetary forms to the kind of digital, electronic, or really disembodied currencies that people are supposed to use on the internet? So in that story, it's one of money removing itself from personal relations, from material forms, political forms, into a realm of pure, objective, quantitative exchangeability and fungibility. And so in that story, Simmel is a key avatar to that key interlocutor. And Simmel, in particular, his discussion of money as both freeing insofar as it loosens the fetters of traditional society, and also anonymizing, turning the world into a giant arithmetic problem. Money here as pure quantitativity and as a terrible destroyer of form. The other story in anthropology, you could think of as a combination of local arcana and cultural difference. And so this kind of work focuses on non-Western and non-modern forms to build up detailed accounts of the workings of local economic worlds explained in cultural terms. And so these efforts are usually much more empirically derived, as opposed to from the founding myths of European social theory. But there is also still a kind of mythicization in this work, that of culture. And so here, for an example, the person I think is probably the most interesting anthropologist working on money today is Jane Geyer, who's an anthropologist of Africa, and uses her West African data as the basis for very nuanced and provocative theorization. But she still frames her studies in a kind of cultural distinctiveness. So she's telling stories very much about what she terms Atlantic Africa. And so the most famous example of the coming together of these two kinds of anthropological approaches to money, so the Simmelian myth of money's progress and this kind of grounded ethnographic cultural story is Paul Bohannon's work on the Tib in Nigeria from the late 50s. And so Bohannon is combining a nuanced, though now roundly critiqued, set of ethnographic details with a recognizably Simonian approach to the destructive aspects of money. So we have money as acid, right? And so again, the quote, money is one of the shatteringly simplifying ideas of all time, and like any other new and compelling idea, it creates its own revolution. And so this is wrong in instructive ways, which I'll talk about later in the paper, but this is kind of the matrix from which my work is emerging, and in particular, the idea that money is the thing that changes local social worlds is one that I think is important to subject to critique. Okay, so I'm intervening in this matrix in a couple ways. So first, in my larger work, one of my main aims is to reconcile these two key narratives. So the story of Western money, or our money, and the story of non-Western money, or their money, right? And so this emerged from my sense that there are broad similarities between the kind of disjunctive economic terrain that Geyer is talking about in contemporary Atlantic Africa, and with pre-modern or pre-industrial economic practice, if not globally, then on a very broad spatial scale. And so, looking at the anthropological accounts and the historical accounts, you can see economic worlds where profit derives not solely from price making in the utopian market, but arbitraging manifold locally configured variables. We're talking about money, currencies, measure, number, many other things. So there's a world that predates utopian price-making markets in which price is only one possible location of profit amongst many. And so I'm trying to find the commonalities between these different places. And so one aspect here is that I think the differences between us and them are historical and structural. And structural in terms of different places existing in different structural positions vis-a-vis the global processes of standardization, formalization I'll talk about in a bit. They're historical and structural differences, not cultural. So I want to sort of get away from anthropology explaining these things in culture and connect things more broadly historically. And so of central importance to this project is looking at a particular historically emergent and territorially dynamic regime of standardization, formalization, and utopianization of economic practice that emerges in the late 18th century in Europe and that is globalized unevenly over the ensuing decades. And also, perhaps more to the point for this particular paper, I would like the focus to shift from what money does, giving money all the agency, to what money has had done to it. So where does money fit in these larger historical processes? So another quote. Nigel Dodd, in his most recent book, says, "Money, all money, contains a utopian strain. This strain is the quality that has fascinated and perplexed social thinkers of almost every possible outlook. Money rests on an extraordinarily powerful ideal, the ideal of complete fungibility." And so I think this is completely wrong. So money as we know it, or as we talk about it, contemporary Western money, as we talk about in anthropology, certainly has these characteristics of being a universal equivalent or of fungibility. But that particular form of money had to be made and is historically specific to. So he's talking. So if we want to rephrase Dodd might be correct if he's talking about money as we know it that's emerged since the beginning of the 1800s in the global north. But otherwise, it's not. So I think instead of saying money has always been utopian, we need to look at the utopianizing. So making money uniform and making general purpose money possible. We need to look at the utopianizing money as a particular historical process. And with that goes the insight that our economic world had to be made placeless. It was not always already placeless. And so this is where this material starts to connect to the themes of this workshop. In the actual story of simplification, so formalization and standardization, money is something that is swept up in these processes of local worlds. It is itself simplified and formalized and standardized, along with number and measure. It's not in the driver's seat so much as it's along for the ride. And so in my work, I'm focusing on the actual historical trajectory of standardization and formalization beyond the Similian myth and Bohannon's refractions of right? So these are actually shattering simplifications, but money is not the thing that is doing the simplifying. Money is something that gets simplified along the way. Okay, so that's part one. Part two, money cannot be analyzed separately from other forms that got caught up in the same regime of standardization. And so what else is standardized starting in the 1780s? Measurement, number. The market is utopianized and standardized. We move away from, it's an old distinction in economic anthropology that's come back through kind of cultural history of Europe now, from the marketplace or marketplaces to the market principle. And arguably, along with that, you have the standardization of the human in the form of ideas about Homo economicus, and the standardization of objects of exchange and the growth and spread of commodity economy. And so in my paper today, I want to focus particularly on measurement and number, or number and numeracy. And so one of the key texts here in thinking about these things is Vitold Kuhla's Measures in Men, where he talks about a transformation that takes place in European economic practice in the long 19th century. He's talking about measure in particular, but I think you can expand this to domains of number and money as well. He's talking about the transition from what he terms experience near or bottom-up customary measures to representational, abstract, top-down forms. And so this is famously applied to the transition from customary forms to the metric system, but it also works in money and number. So just as an idea of how things worked before. For example, Sir John Riggs Miller in 1790 in the UK said, we cannot go from one parish to another or from one market to another without learning a new language, which no grammar or dictionary will enable us to acquire. A century before that, John Houghton provided an interesting but brief survey of measurements, local measurements in England. He found that a pound of butter might weigh just 6 ounces at Huntingdon, but 36 ounces in Cheshire. A stone was just 8 pounds at Hertford and Hitchin, 16 at Leeds, Halifax, and Dorchester, and 18 pounds in many northern counties. And a bushel was 8 gallons at Brecon, Pembroke, and many other places, but as much as 32 for wheat and rye at Chester, even 40 for oats at the same place. Houghton also noted the use of some irregular measures in various places. In East Lancashire and Eigendale are 7 quarts, at Berwick, a bowl or 6 bushels, at Manchester, possibly my favorite, obsolete measure, the hoop, H-O-O-L-P, of 8 gallons, and a new hoop of 12 gallons, and in the north of England, a windle of 26 gallons. And so this is true for England. It's famously true in France, where they said that there was something approaching 60,000 measures of weight in France before 1789, and you can also find these phenomena more broadly with looking at New Spain if you're looking at Asia. And so the kinds of transformations that happen starting in the 1780s, the paradigmatic transformation is the introduction of the metric system in France. The replacement of all of this extraordinarily disjunctive terrain of thousands of local measures with what historian Ken Alder calls a rational language that was deliberately crafted to break the hold of the old regime's political economy and serve as the idiom of the modern mechanism of exchange. And so Alder basically describes the implementation of the metric system in revolutionary France as being centrally concerned with creating a standardized national market in which profit making based on price replaced multifarious arbitrage across the thousands of locally specific customary measures as the primary mode of legitimate profit making. So the metric system, in Alder's vision of it, is far from utopian. It's actually a very interested way of remaking the market on a national scale. And so other folks, Theodore Porter and others, describe similar processes in England and elsewhere as akin to a power grab by the center in the name of objectivity. So there's an interest on the part of centralized power to eliminate local knowledge as being a requirement for participation in markets and the way that it is supported, or the sort of the buttressing for this imposition is, it's really more rational, it's really more objective. How could you not want to do it this way? And so arguably, I think that these are the shattering simplifications whose echoes ramify through Bohannon. So Bohannon is talking about money as being shatteringly simplified, but there's actually an echo of this reconfiguration of local economic worlds in Europe along simplified lines that finds a kind of refraction. So it's not only true for measure, we also can talk about number. So Keith Thomas, in a fascinating article on numeracy in early modern England, recounts John Quincy Adams' account of how numbers work over there. So John Quincy Adams told the US Congress that in England, numbers lose the definite character which is essential to their nature. He was thinking of those stylized quantities like the baker's dozen, into which there entered an element of gift exchange or complementary excess, like the modern tradesman's discount. The most ubiquitous of these, Thomas says, was the great or long hundred. Though originally 60, this now varied so much according to the quantity concerned that all that can be said for certain is that the one total it never indicated was 100. Citizens of London claimed tret, whereby they received not 100 pounds of groceries or drugs, but 104 pounds. 100 in tin or copper was 112 pounds, the modern hundredweight. In herrings or ells of canvas, 100 was 120. In codfish and ling, it meant 124. For some other fish, it could mean 180. So prior to the late 18th century, number and measurement are locally configured and unpredictable, right? So economic practice consists in working across thresholds of local categories. And so akin to the imposition, the introduction of the metric system, was the popularization of decimalization in number. And I think this is a very clear example of Kula's transition from experienced near customary practice to abstract top-down representational practice. So when we think about this, what does that actually mean? So folks remember how many pence were in the pre-decimal pound, of course? 240. So think about all the different factors that 240 is divisible by. So it's divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12, 15, 16, and 20. So if you have to divide amounts between a certain number of family members or customers, 240 is a much more supple number to deal with than 10 or 100. So in this light, the shift from 12, who Rice Vaughan wrote in 1675, 12 is the most proper, of all the numbers, 12 is the most proper for money. The shift from 12 to 10 as the base of the monetary system can be, I think, seen clearly as an example of the kind of transition that Kula is talking about. And so the interesting, and so the point here is that both the metric system, and as an American I have a very peculiar, I guess it's not that peculiar, but Americans are constantly being told, why don't you just adopt the metric system? It's the most rational system there is, come on, get with the program, right? So the metric system and decimal counting, they're both so strongly naturalized in the present moment that we tend to forget the work that went into their institutionalization. And we also tend to forget that both of these interventions, both the metric system and decimalization, were initially failures. So that even though the initial kind of utopian projects were introduced in the 1780s and 90s, they don't really catch on globally until the 1860s or 70s, if not later. And so the imperial system of 1824, which gets a lot of bad press, right? How could you have 5,280 feet in a mile? So completely irrational. The imperial system of 1824 was actually a response to the perceived failure of the metric system, right? So if you look at it from one perspective, the imperial system is actually superior to the metric system because it minimized the disruption of everyday commerce and customary practice, and therefore it wasn't a failure initially. So Julian Hoppett talks about the introduction of the imperial system as being based on a conservative approach. And he says this conservatism appears to have been caused by the belief that metrication in France had not worked. So the perception was most probably that metrication in France had failed because it was revolutionary rather than reformist in intent. So sweeping were the changes that they were insufficiently attractive to the mass of people. And on decimals, right? So John Quincy Adams, I'll spare you the long quote about how money works all across the eastern seaboard of America in non-decimal ways, and the official decimal forms remaining state secrets. But he has a great quote: "Decimal arithmetic is a contrivance of man for computing numbers, and not a property of time, space, or matter. Nature has no partialities for the number 10, and the attempt to shackle her freedom with them will forever prove abortive." So these are not particularly prophetic words, because clearly we're all counting in tens, but they indicate the degree to which things have changed. Okay. And so if we're looking at the institution, that's not the right word, if we're looking at the birth and propagation of the measurement and numerological unions that we inhabit, we have to move 50 years on from the introduction of these forms to the period between the 1840s and 1870s, and even as late as 1971 in the UK, right? So decimalization there would be akin to America finally going metric. And so these things latch on very slowly in the 19th century, along with things like the nation state and standard currency. So all of these things are traveling together in certain respects. And if we want to understand how these different kinds of processes work, we have to look at them in connection. And remember the work that went into them. And so now they're so naturalized that if you look at the anthropological or really economic sociological literature on money, people can't figure out why these things would have even existed, right? So Mitchell Innes wrote, what would be the use of a yard measure which might be sometimes 2'6" and sometimes 3'6" at the whim of the maker, or a pint which might sometimes be but 2/3 of a pint and sometimes a pint and a half. So there's a conceptual challenge to deal with the complexity of the terrain of money, number, and measurement that predates our standard forms that we have a hard time getting around. That's part two. So part three, the larger question, sort of thinking about what can we learn is a spatial transformation. And so how do we think about union making as reshaping a terrain of thresholds, right? So economic practice or numerical practice or measurement practice as working across a terrain of borders or boundaries. So if you think of, we went on the tour of Warburg yesterday, and the tour guide kept making reference to the wall between the old town and the new town, right? So you have, these lines that run through even these very small principalities. There's a shift from economic practice as, at least in some part characterized by the working across these boundaries, to now we have a terrain that's configured as usually a national interior. So everything happens within the boundaries. So there's a shift from working across thresholds to working in a kind of, what I think is a kind of ecumenical framework. So you have this new unified open spatial form that goes along with the transition, to utopian price-making markets into these formalized and standardized forms of measurement and number. Okay, and so this final part is, okay, what can we learn from these processes of transformation that might help us think about the contemporary fate of monetary units? So just a couple lessons I've drawn, and then some speculation. So I think when we're thinking about the utopias of contemporary economic practice, we need obviously to pay attention to both history and to spatiality. We need to, and it's nice to hear the papers here because it's not anthropologists, we're not talking about culture, we're talking about empirical stuff for the most part. We need to not move always to culture as an explanation, we need to look at histories of power. Having said that, we also need to pay attention to the cultural meaningfulness, the cultural meanings related to uniformity, formalization, standardization, objectivity. Another point, if all modern monies are money unions, right, so we think about state-issued currencies that are uniformly available within a nation state. Of course, this model is ending, but this is the kind of the imagined model we have of state currencies available to everyone, everywhere, to pay for all things at all times and places. We need to start thinking about the question of scale. So what does it mean to talk about a money union on a national scale as opposed to a continental scale? And so Farley made a comment on the street the other day. I think you said you always thought that Mississippi should leave the dollar.
Yes.
Yes. So what kind of kinship is there between a national money union and a supranational money union? And it's interesting because we've talked about the euro quite a bit, but no one is really clamoring to dissolve metrological or numerological unions. Like the closest example I could think of was in Burma for a while. All of the currency was denominated multiples of 9. So you have to count, like you get the $90 bills and you have to count, 90, 180, 270. But for the most part, that's not the case. And so the key issue here, I think, and now I'm getting into sort of my current interests, lies in the divergence of money and measure. So prior to the beginning of this sort of the metric regime of standardization, you found money and measure in combined forms. So you found them in, if we're thinking about it in monetary terms, you found money and measure as both hybrids of what one might call fiat, one might call commodities. So elements of human political choice and a kind of grounding of the meaning of these things in nature. And what's happened over the last 200 years is there's money and measure have separated. And there's been a movement towards thinking of measurement, if we're thinking about measurement in the context of the SI, right? Measurement is imagined as emerging from nature, right? There was this whole thing of trying to redefine the kilogram at the most recent conference of the International Committee on Weights and Measures in 2014. We want to find the proper natural constant to ground it. So measurement is imagined as emerging from nature, and money's association with nature is now seen to have failed, or is now seen to be a kind of nostalgic reclamation project. We want to link money back up to the real source of its value. And so I have a tentative argument here that part of this has to do, so you have money and measurement diverge, and you also have the coalescing of multiple functions of money that once were distributed across different monetary media in this new standardized general purpose money. And I think that the naturalization of the relationship between money and account and other functions of general purpose money has resulted in a reduction of thinking about money's metrological functions. Right? So if you're looking at the anthropology of money, anthropologists are interested in money as a kind of universal equivalent. They don't think about it as measured. Okay, and so where does this go? I think if we're looking at, again, the divergence of money and measurement, if you're looking at how number unions and measure unions work or spread, I think there's an important, what am I trying to say? An important aspect of their convincingness is their symbolic association with nature and objectivity. And so I think that money's now perceived non-naturalness inhibits the potential for success of money unions linked to perceived non-natural units. So what does that mean? It means that no one is agitating to end the metric system apart from the US, right? But there's no agitation against this form of measurement union because measurement is perceived to be grounded in the unarguable terrain of nature. And the money unions that are seen as unarguable are also grounded in something that possesses at least a quasi-natural character. And so that's the nation state. The nation state exists on the boundary between something that we see as informed by human meaning and something that's shaped That's a sort of a natural ontological form. And so what's happened is the formation of national money unions has been effectively dehistoricized, right? And so in anthropology, this is the sort of the influence of classical social theory narratives. And so I think that's why national money unions are not necessarily subject to the same kind of critiques that supranational money unions are. And so it seems to me that a prerequisite for successful monetary unions conceived on supranational terrain would be the naturalization of supranational forms of political community. So there needs to be some way of naturalizing a political community beyond the nation for a supranational, I'm sorry that national and natural sound the same, for this to work. And just as one final point, one alternate way of looking at this would be to go back to the contrast between the metric system and the imperial system, and this distinction between reformist and revolutionary ways of making unions. And so the Euro project seems to me very much revolutionary and utopian, and it sort of raises the question, was there a way of making that kind of union that wouldn't have made it so difficult to adopt, and that was more attuned to the pre-existing customary forms? So that's a bit of idle speculation at the end, but thank you for